Good morning, everyone. I'm Graham Hishmurgh, Director at Altair. I'm really pleased to welcome you to our local authorities webinar this morning, in which we're going to look at some aspects of the upcoming changes to social housing consumer regulation. Now, it's not a briefing on what the changes are in the usual sense. I'm sure everyone's been doing the reading and no doubt has already been briefed to death. Rather, what we want to cover are issues connected to preparedness and hopefully provide some relevant and practical pointers. So the purpose being to generate some ideas and discussion in your own organisations. Now, I don't want to get too diverted in this webinar on the wider political and economic turmoil that's unfolding around us, but obviously, we're all acutely aware of how challenging the operating environment is for all of us actually involved in social housing, but particularly for local authorities. And it's only going to get more challenging, isn't it, in the coming months and even years. So we know that suggestions that involve layering expensive, resource-heavy new processes and teams on top of existing arrangements to deal with the changes is not going to wash. So instead, I hope what we say is practical and useful. To cover the topic today, we've got two of my esteemed colleagues here at Altair, Anne-Marie Bancroft, passionate about tenant engagement, and Kevin Harris, equally passionate about building health and safety. And we are also really pleased to have an equally esteemed guest from the regulator, Kate Dodsworth, who I'm sure everyone knows Kate. She's Director of Consumer Regulation at RSH. Now, the programme is up on the slide. We aim to keep the presentations, short and sharp, with plenty of time for Kate afterward to share her thoughts. And then we're also leaving time for a Q&A. So please do submit questions throughout the session so we can pick out some at the end of the presentations. And we plan to get you back to your busy schedules by about 10 to 12 today. So enough of me. Over to our first speaker, to Anne-Marie.
Thank you, Graham. Just having a bit of time coming off on mute. Just to start things out, I think that the importance of all these kind of webinars and discussions that we're having about the future regulatory environment must go back to the reason why we're here effectively. The raft of regulatory change has come about from the Grenfell fire tragedy, and ultimately my perspective is that organisations should look to the Grenfell fire tragedy and learnings from there to be able to start to change their approach to consumer in the future. Now, Grenfell was obviously the initial incident that resulted in the change in regulation, but following on from that, we've seen a lot of press attention about the provision of accommodation, the quality of homes following on, and then also a lot of social media activism. Now, what local authorities should seek to do is not just look at the regulation. We've got a variety of regulation. We've got the consumer regulator with us today, but also we've got the future building safety regulator that local authorities are going to have to work with and engage with. And not look at those two pieces of regulation separately, but through one lens of where it's come about from. And to do that, organisations should really think about culture and the culture surrounding customer engagement, culture surrounding tenant voice, and the cultures that they have in place with their customer service provision for their tenants. Now, there is a huge risk that the regulatory environment that's been created post-Grenfell will create silo working. And what we seek to do in this webinar is to really think about the importance of making sure that looking from the culture lens, that silo working is overcome. And everybody's focused on the same tasks. You can't have your building safety teams considering building safety in one room, and then also your housing services teams considering consumer regulation in another room. At its core, it all goes down to culture of organisations. So to run through this slide, culture, local authorities need to start with culture. And one of the key things about culture and with tenant engagement, that it's absolutely vital that organisations focus on internal cultures to begin with, because it is unlikely to be your director of asset management who does direct engagement with customers on a regular basis. It's more likely to be those who are working within your operational teams. So organisations should really focus on embracing a culture of listening to and acting on tenant voice. And that's not an easy feat for some organisations. The key for customer engagement, it shouldn't sit with a customer engagement team to do engagement, because then it's othering it. It must be throughout services. It must be considered at every step of decision making. So it's absolutely vital that that culture comes from leadership, and embracing tenant voice does so as well. Alongside culture, it's really important that tenants are empowered. I know it's a bit of an interesting word, empowerment. It's quite often bandied around, and historically housing providers and local authorities would discuss tenant empowerment, but not in the way that tenants had true power. So creating structures and governance processes to be able to, where tenant voice can be acted on and listened to, is absolutely vital. And really being quite self-critical of those structures and making sure that they actually deliver what they're expected to do. There's no point in having a forum that's set up that isn't functioning the way it should. If anything, you're letting down the people who are in attendance of that, but also your organisation, because if you're hiding behind failing engagement services, then that's not going to really wash, not just with the regulator, but with the reason why we're here. The key as well is communication. It always comes down to communication and repairs. Generally, those are the two things that tenants tell us are the problems. So communication should be accessible, personable, and it should create better relationships with your tenants. You've got long-standing relationships with your tenants. As local authorities, quite a lot of the tenants you have maybe never left your local authority area. You've got lifetime relationships to maintain, and it's absolutely vital that you understand the complexities of those relationships. One of the interesting things I've encountered during my time in the sector was tenants who were still scarred from decants that had happened to their parents and grandparents. Those are very complex relationships to maintain into the future. It's not easily and simply answered by one particularly nice housing officer visiting. It's going to take a lot. It's complex, and it's about creating honesty and transparency. If that trust has been lost, it will take years to regain, or maybe never again. Transparency can create trust if your organisations are making decisions that impact tenants. So transparency about why those decisions have taken place, but also on a very day-to-day basis. We're struggling to get roofing companies into our organisation to be able to fix the roof. Therefore, that's resulted in you having a leak for a substantially long time than we would have expected. We're not happy with that. Therefore, we are going to communicate how we're fixing that. The other thing is laying that with the knowledge. You as an organisation should know who your customers are, who you're serving, and how you are providing services to them. And then when you're making decisions, your decisions should be based on that knowledge of knowing who you are serving, who's living in your accommodation. And that should also that knowledge should apply across everything. When you're empowering customers, you should be looking at empowering representative groups to be involved, and being conscious of things like social housing stigma that your tenants do face on a regular basis, and being honest internally about that with your teams. There's a variety of things about the knowledge that you have to understand your tenants and how your services are delivered to them. And finally, we know that there's a huge emphasis on complaints, and complaints isn't complaints, it's a resolution place. It's where your tenants should seek resolution. That should be the place where they should be finding the ability to resolve huge concerns that they may have with your service provision. It may be the ability for them to be compensated if needs be, but your complaints processes shouldn't exist to satisfy the regulatory environment in the housing ombudsman. They should exist so you resolve customers' concerns when they come to you. And there should be processes for learning from complaints. And, you know, all of these types of webinars always say there's a huge raft of learning from complaints, but really, are you learning from complaints? And are you pulling the lines from the complaint about a system issue to the potential systemic system issue that may exist for more people? Or are you pulling the line from, actually everybody's made a particular complaint about our repair service, therefore we've applied it to our service improvement plans, and communicating how those complaints are really serving you? That's generally to give a broad perspective of the context that I want you to think of, and when you're going on the changes that will be required to meet proactive consumer regulation and future building safety regulation, that really it needs to go back to that point of why are we all here, why we're having this conversation, and what you are doing, does it wash with what we've learned from Grenfell? So I'll pass back over to Graham. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Just a quick question, actually, before we move on. What does good culture look like?
Yeah, a good culture would look like honesty, I think, is the best starting point for a good culture. As well, one of the key things as well is that your frontline staff will always have a really good understanding of their relationship they have with your tenants. And an ability to speak up, not just from tenants to speak up, but frontline staff having the ability to speak up. There's quite a lot of information that they will see, and a lot of identification of service failure that they will see on the day-to-day basis. If you're picking up 70 calls in the call centre a day, you'll have a real good grip of what's going wrong. So a good culture would look like an honest relationship, not just with your tenants, but with your frontline staff. And it'd also look like transparency, a lot of transparency about what type of decisions you're making and why you're making decisions. But it ultimately comes from the top. That kind of culture can't exist on its own. It needs to come from the top. So from leadership in explaining why we are unable to do X, Y, and Z. Being able to be honest with your customers about the no's. Quite a lot of the time, organisations will say, "You said we did," but when are you saying "you said we didn't"? A lot of tenants will ask for things that aren't feasible and cannot be provided, yet they'll continually ask for particular things. For example, a smaller organisations may not be able to provide an app, a tenant app, for example, but being clear about the reasons why that's not been provided shows that there's a culture of, actually, we understand you're saying this, but we're not able to help in that area, is absolutely vital. So yeah, really about honesty, I think that's the key, and building trust. But trust can be huge. It's something that really needs to be thought about, especially for long-standing relationships. The regulatory environment has changed huge amount of times, even just during my career in housing. But it will, and it's likely to change again in the future. But your relationship with your tenants is always going to maintain. How many tenants have you got that have lived in your accommodation for over 20 years, 40 years? That relationship will always have to stay in place. So really the culture has to prevail. That's the only way of it being a good, positive relationship.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Jodie, can we move over to Kevin, please?
Thank you. Thank you, Graham. And thank you very much, Anne-Marie. Well, welcome to you all. And as Graham said right at the very beginning, thank you for joining us this morning. So by way of introduction, I'm Kevin Harris. I'm a director at Altair, building surveyor by profession and responsible for leading our technical team. So this morning I've been asked to talk about consumer regulation, but very much through the lens of health and safety. My aim really is to provide some background, but most importantly of all, some practical advice in terms of, how you and colleagues, your organisations move forwards. Next slide, please. Okay, so very, very quickly, Approximately a year ago, the government published the Social Housing White Paper, the Charter for Social Housing, which we'll all be very familiar with. So as you'll be aware, this paper really proposed changes to the consumer regulation of social housing, to strengthen the accountability of landlords to provide quality homes, quality services, and also to treat residents with greater respect. Now, many of the changes will be implemented by the government as the regulator of social housing. We'll hear more on that from Kate shortly. Most of these changes will be made when Parliament has passed legislation. At the moment, it's a little bit difficult to say exactly when that will be, given what's going on at Westminster at the moment. But bottom line, the government has said it will introduce legislation, and it will do so as soon as possible. Now, what this means, and this is quite a key point, what this means is the new consumer standards cannot be implemented yet. However, there is a very clear expectation on the part of government that councillors, board members, executive teams start immediately at looking at opportunities to drive improvement, looking at how they can improve services, looking at how they can improve engagement with residents. Now, the response to those expectations set by the white paper will need to be taken forward alongside not only the current focus on stock investment to deliver building safety, but also energy efficiency improvements. But they'll also need to be delivered in parallel with the continuing need to deliver high quality housing for local housing need, which is no mean feat. But key message on this slide is very much don't wait, start now. Okay, all right. So very helpfully, the government have provided a vision. This is on screen, you can read it at your leisure, but I think the key thing here to note is the definition of landlord, which is quite broad. So not only does it cover councils, but it also covers for-profit providers, as well as, you would expect, housing associations as well. Within the new standards, there are effectively 10 published outcomes. Looking through the lens of health and safety, there are 4 that are particularly noteworthy. Not surprisingly, social housing stock should meet the decent homes standard. Similarly, landlords should ensure social housing meets health and safety requirements. However, what is interesting is the next couple. So tenants have access to information that you hold on their homes. And finally, landlords work with other agencies to contribute to the safety and well-being of the areas within which those homes are located. Those last 2 are particularly interesting. So along a similar line, the government have grouped things together under 6 themes. They are on screen. From a health and safety stance, there is a government expectation that landlords meet their safety responsibilities. Not surprisingly, this includes the home as well as common parts. Similarly, there's an expectation on the part of the regulator that services, common parts and homes are of quality. And finally, the information that you hold on your residents' homes and your buildings is available, it's accessible, and it's easy to understand. Right, Kate's going to say a bit more on this, so I won't steal her thunder, but I think the key thing here is it's fair to say that the government's approach to consumer regulation is still very much under discussion and yet to be finalised. What can be said is what can be said is, the government envisages employing a combination of those things on screen to gain assurance that, as we've touched on, we are providing quality homes and services, information is being readily provided, and residents and stakeholders are being listened to. Now, ultimately, the government needs to confirm the new consumer standards before it can finalise how best to gain assurance. But as I say, this slide gives you a feel for the sorts of tools that they will be using to gain that reassurance. Okay, so practical advice. So what I would say, and this very much echoes what Anne-Marie was saying a little earlier. So if you haven't done so already, you need to start the process of identifying opportunities to drive improvement now. It has to be a corporate effort. It has to be a cross-departmental approach. This was the point that Anne made earlier. Silo working will not deliver the outcomes and reassurance required. Corporately, your response needs to have a strategic and an operational focus. Personally, I would recommend that you have an executive sponsor, you have an accountable director, and you have a responsible director to provide direction, focus, but to reinforce the importance of this exercise. I would also strongly advise that those colleagues that are asked to assist in this exercise have the necessary capability, but of equal importance, they have the capacity. Be clear that this is not part of the day job. It needs to be understood that this is a standalone business critical activity which needs to be prioritised and resourced appropriately. I would say, remember above all else, this is about reassurance. Place yourself in the shoes of the regulator, in the shoes of your residents. What level of information would you require to reassure you? Now, in terms of asset information, the information you hold about your buildings, your resident homes, I would recommend you conduct an urgent review and also in parallel a gap analysis. How is the information stored? What media is it available in? If it's paper-based, is it capable of being digitised? What's readily available, but equally, what's missing? What would you expect to be there, but you can't lay your hands on? And can you source it? Can you source it from the original party, or do you need to procure it from a third party? I think the other thing I would say is spreadsheets are not the answer. We are in pursuit of one version of the truth and the golden thread that Dame Hackett referenced in her recent report. This is about a database approach. Just on information, but very much from a resident's perspective. So is the information that you hold, whether it's certificates, warranties, manuals, maintenance schedules, is it available? Is it in an accessible format? And is it easy for a layperson to understand? Recognising that this is a sizable piece of work and it is quite daunting, my advice would be step back, break it down into its component parts, start with the essentials and follow up with the desirables. I would have regular internal review meetings. If helpful, I'd use a tracker to chart your progress, chart your journey, maintain a clear action log, provide periodic position statements to senior colleagues, whether that's executive teams, board members, councillors. And also, this is a joint team effort. Use your framework partners. If you've got framework consultants, framework contractors, use them. If there's information missing, use them to help you. Now, post-Grenfell, Altair have been working successfully with a number of early adopters. We've been assisting them with building safety cases using dynamic AIM. Now, this is a database approach to digitising their information, which has really given them an opportunity to respond not only to the forthcoming consumer changes, but also meeting the requirements of the building regulator as well as their own internal governance structures. It's also provided a means to identify gaps with their information. Not surprisingly, not all of the information that they thought they held was readily available, which has meant procuring that from other parties. Now, at Altair, we are able to provide tailored help. if this is of interest, then by all means, let Graham or I know we're here to assist. Just really to give you a sense of some of the work that we've been doing, just to kind of give you a flavour of how we might be able to help. So, we've assisted clients to respond to the requirements of not only the building and consumer regulator, but we've undertaken, as you can see on screen, we've provided full customer engagement reviews. We continue to provide building safety project and governance reviews. We have digitised, I think at the latest position, we've digitised key building safety data for 1,000 buildings. We continue to prepare draft building safety case reports for clients. We've submitted over 40 building safety fund applications, many of which have been successful, and those that haven't are still pending. We continue to project manage the remediation of over 70 buildings, many of which require recladding. And we continue as a consultancy to provide start-to-end process for the identification, prioritisation and remediation of building safety. So in summary, just to wrap up, consumer and building regulation with social housing is changing. Be in no doubt it has started. Under no circumstances, stick your head in the sand and hope it isn't. Start looking for improvement. Start now if you haven't done so already. But hopefully you are already on that journey. And remember, we are here to assist you if that is of help. Thank you. I'll now hand back to Graham.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Yeah, we're going to move straight on to Kate, actually. So Kate, your thoughts and reflections, please. And I know from conversations that if you weren't going to cover this, I know everyone's asking, with all the political turmoil, is this still happening?
Good place to start. Thank you, Graham, and thanks to Kevin and to Anne-Marie. I was going to chip in on this in any case, because one of the first things I was going to talk about was timelines. Then I'm going to unpack a little bit about some of the themes that have already come up in terms of what local authorities in particular should be doing now, and then talk to you a little bit about how we might go about regulating this. So to start with that first question, I mean, the ship has sailed, and I think that's a really good thing. Obviously, I would say that. But if we go back to Anne-Marie's points about where this potentially started, with the horrendous tragedy of Grenfell, then the Green Paper, and then just over 2 years ago, the Social Housing White Paper, and then finally the bill in the Queen's Speech, and now trundling through Parliament. Do you know, I've not spoken to a single stakeholder group that has said to me, this is a bad thing to do. I think everybody in the sector, be it tenants, local authorities, housing associations, or anyone around the periphery, thinks that it's high time there was some cultural recalibration that puts tenants' influence back at the sort of centre of the organisation, and had a clear line of sight at the governance level, be it local councillors for local authorities or boards, on the issues that are important to tenants. So the bill is going through Parliament, and I'm really, really confident that it has sailed. I mean, some good news indeed is the sort of relative speed at which it is going through Parliament. It is a good piece of legislation, and we've heard that from sort of cross-party peers, that it's a good piece of legislation to go through. And I think politically, for wherever people are on the spectrum, it's a bit of a no-brainer, really, that the sort of social housing regulation bill and the changes that have been long sort of tailed come to fruition. So real confidence that this is where we're going to end up. And I think in terms of timelines, then, we published our definitive statement of the tenant satisfaction measures just under a month ago. You can access a range of sort of ways of looking at that on our website. There is the huge tome with guidance that you might well want to wade through, or you might want some of your analyst colleagues to wade through. There is the summary document that is really helpful, I think, for local councillors and for boards of housing associations. And then actually, just as an aside, for anyone anyone running specialist housing provision for tenants with learning disability, there's an easy read document so that engagement with all tenants is universal, so that can be used as well. So the tenant satisfaction measures is out. In terms of timelines on that, we would expect landlords to be setting up systems now following that guidance, and to be collecting their first year of data from 1st of April 2023 to 31st of March 2024. We went first on the tenant satisfaction measures because that was the piece of the work from the Social Housing White Paper that didn't require legislative change, so we got on with that. I think as just sort of one point, there is a danger that people might think that's all there is to proactive consumer regulation. And whilst they're an incredibly useful can opener for scrutiny for us and for tenants, importantly, to look at their performance of their landlord around 22 questions, I think there needs to be more to proactive consumer regulation to meet the outcomes that were originally intended in the white paper. So as luck would have it, as we all know, thank goodness, there is more to it. But we need to wait until we get direction from Secretary of State to kick off a consultation on the revised consumer standards. Of course, you all know that we have consumer standards currently. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater on those, but we will be coming out for formal consultation just as soon as we get direction and the bill receives royal assent. I'm hoping that that will be at some point around spring next year. We will come out for formal consultation on the revised consumer standards that will fit the themes that were there in the Social Housing White Paper. Now, one of the things that we get asked a lot is how will you mark the homework? And I was really struck by a point that Anne-Marie made, that you shouldn't be doing this just to satisfy the regulator. You should be doing this for the good of your landlord services and for your tenants. The original aim of the Social Housing White Paper was that tenants live in good quality homes and universally have access to good landlord services and safe homes, as Kevin has just sort of outlined. And I think we need to be really, really focused on that outcome. Nevertheless, how we will be going about getting assurance, again, this will be up for grabs next year as we do more and more engagement with different stakeholder groups. And for local authorities, of course, you're not subject to our proactive engagement on the economic side. So when we talk about the build out model of in-depth assessments, you're not yet party to how that works. So just a very, very quick unpacking for those that don't know. We will give some notice to a landlord that we're coming to town. We will send off for pages of documents that might follow a particular line of inquiry, but will certainly fit the sort of consumer standards. And then we will send a team in to the landlord. At the moment, for housing associations on the economic side, we sort of pull down the lamp on the chair, the chief executive, the top team, follow those sort of questions against our standards. And I think the important thing for proactive consumer regulation, where this gets really interesting, is what is the tenant input to that? Because through all of this, we have set ourselves 3 tests. And I hope, by the way, that this gives you some assurance. The 3 tests are: whatever we do must make a meaningful difference to tenants. We've been hearing why that has to be the case. Why would anybody do this, wherever they are on the political spectrum or the housing spectrum, if this didn't make a meaningful difference to tenants? Number 2, we have to be able to regulate it. And I would like to think at the moment we are trusted to deliver regulation in a way that is by set processes and people don't have huge shocks and surprises. Now, on consumer regulation, of course, there is far more qualitative information than quantitative, and we have to find a way of wrestling some of that to the ground and making it quantitative so that we can regulate it, and more on that in just a moment. And the third point is it has to be deliverable by landlords. Now, we know on the housing association side, it's an incredibly diverse sector. You add into that yourselves, local authorities, and we really do understand some of the trade-offs and issues that you have that are different to housing associations, but everybody is trying to achieve the same outcomes. You know, I talk to local authorities on a regular basis. I talk to the umbrella bodies. We will be doing more engagement specifically with local authorities and writing to you all by the end of the year. We will offer ourselves up for briefings with local councillors, coming to talk to forums and so on. But we understand that for local authorities, there isn't just the housing brief. You know, you say to any local authority, health and social care, you talk about budgets, some undergoing in-year budget cuts, the different governance with local councillors, some local councillors not having particular specialisms, maybe in housing, and the neatness in comparison of a housing board where everybody is sort of focused in the same way. Nevertheless, it is perfectly possible to deliver proactive consumer regulation to local authorities. You have governance. It may be different, but you have governance. And I think I'll come back to sort of hopefully my sort of final point on how you wrestle some of this into quantitative data. Your local councillors and your top teams will need to give us, the regulator, evidence of your own assurance against the revised consumer standards. What does that mean for you now? What should you be doing? Data, data, data. Both Kevin and Anne-Marie have made this point. Data on your tenants. What are your tenants telling you? Where is there any differentiation in the sort of groupings of tenants, for instance? Are tenants differing in their satisfaction via ethnicity or via where they live or particular stock? What's your stock condition telling you? Is it telling you something about your business plans that you need to be picking up on rather more quickly? Back to Anne-Marie's point, is there something that you have to deliver to tenants that's bad news, but you've got a plan for dealing with it? You have to sort of make sure you are on top of your data so you can give us evidence of your assurance, not reassurance that somewhere there's an Excel spreadsheet in the drawer that's got the answer. And I think this leads back to culture. We're talking to thousands of tenants, and I'm not exaggerating, face-to-face thousands of tenants and as part of our stakeholder engagement. And overwhelmingly, tenants are saying to us, it's repairs, it's communication, and you must focus on getting these things right. We've seen a number of unedifying examples in the media over the last year. How do you know that that's not you? Because if you're not focusing on the data and you're not giving a clear line of sight to your local councillors and leaders on what's happening at the front line and what those trends are telling you from tenants, then you're not going to be able to pass the homework. Because whatever we design within those three tests will not be performative, symbolic, cram the night before, pass on the day with some tick box exercises. Yes, we've got a water cooler and reception. It will be much more transformative and cultural. Graham, I can see we're out of time and we need to get to a discussion and questions, but you know I could talk for 10 years on this, so I'll pause there.
Thanks, Kate. That's really, really interesting. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. If you could stay off mute, Kate, actually, because there are a few questions coming in. They seem to be more directed for you. I'll give you two to begin with, actually, if that's all right. One is just about Wales, actually. Are you able to comment on the position in Wales? And then the second one is, you started to touch on this, but someone has asked, and I hear this a lot actually from local authorities, and it's sometimes said pejoratively that you don't really understand the difference in the governance arrangements between local authorities and, say, housing associations. You've just said there is a difference, but can you say a bit more about what that difference would mean in terms of the way you engage at this stage? Is it possible to comment on that?
Yeah, that's true.
Okay.
So easy on the Wales
yeah.
one. Our remit is for England only. As someone who's been in the housing sector for 30 years, it doesn't mean that personally I'm quite interested in what goes on in the housing sector in Wales, but our remit is for England only. Now, the differences on the governance side, and we're in sort of regular bilateral meetings with the LGA and London councils, for instance, and we talk through this on a number of occasions. And one of the things that comes up and might well be behind your question is for some local councillors in particular, there is the volatility of the political cycles, and you know, housing association boards have the 9-year rule, but there's much more change and churn on the local authority side. And then the issue that you might have sort of housing cabinet members who, with some luck, have some specialism in housing, but maybe not so, and there aren't the sort of range of skills, particularly on housing. Now, where we come to on this is, I think it's almost similar to the debate we have around involved tenants. And it's about data and transparency. And I think if you're going to affect change for any of this, you have to make sure that whatever data you are producing, whatever information you have, is so clear and transparent that people can easily have that line of sight. I talk about a data dashboard that everyone will have on finance and everyone will have on health and safety compliance. And no matter your governance setup, you need to be really confident that you have a data dashboard on these things that will matter to tenants. And I don't want to presuppose the outcome of the consumer standards consultation, because we're not there yet. And some of this is yet to be designed, but I don't think it is beyond the wit to set up something that is transparent and clear, no matter the type of governance.
Okay. Thanks, Kate. There's a couple more questions coming in. Well, yeah, one's about self-referral. We have started to see, haven't we, more local authorities self-referring. I mean, that's obviously a positive thing, I imagine, from the regulator's point of view. But what are the factors that authorities ought to be considering when they do, you know, have to consider self-referral?
That's a really good point. And if I'd had some more time, I'd talk about compliance against our current consumer standards. So thanks for that. I mean, if you look at our consumer regulation review that we put out every year, the last one came out about 2 months ago, you will see in there some really interesting case studies about self-referral. Lots of things that come through self-referral. That is fantastic. That's what we want. And I think as we continue to build our relationship with local authorities, I would hope to see much more in terms of almost, if you like, on health and safety near misses being reported, and people confident that they can refer to us and say, look, this has happened. We're open about it. This is what we're doing. And then it goes through our sort of processes for looking at. We see far more near misses on the sort of PRP side, if you like. Some of the things that we are seeing is sort of health and safety compliance right across the range, but you would expect that through our current consumer standards. I think one point that I would make, and again, it comes back to culture, one of the observations I've seen on some of those sort of self-referrals is that often, and this is right across the sector, often that can come when there is a new team in town. And, you know, I'll take my regulatory hat off for a second and put on my previous operational hat just to feel the pain and own some of this. I think it's really important to create a culture where problems and issues can be quickly surfaced to the top so that they can be put right, rather than a knee-jerk reaction in your teams that think, oh God, no one wants to hear this, let's bury the bad news so we don't feel the heat from up top. And I think there is a real interesting cultural point there. So what is it that would make the current team in town want to come and talk to us rather than wait for new brooms? And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, thanks. We've got a question about complaints, actually, and is it about the disparity between internal complaint processing targets and the Ombudsman's 10-day? Any advice on resolving this? Is that, Anne-Marie, is that something that you've seen before?
I've not seen that specific concern before in relation to transitioning to, so it's James McHugh's done a comment saying we operate a 20-day target across the council, but looks like we need to transition to 10 days according to the Housing Ombudsman, and that'll be the code, the complaints handling code. Have any advice on resolving this matter? My off the top of my head view would be that you'd need to adjust to fit with the complaints handling code. So then that may in fact change the approach to complaints across the council for housing related complaints. However, there might be something about stakeholder engagement about that 20-day target that should be considered anyway, to explore whether it seems to be fit for purpose elsewhere. So that's where I would say on resolving that. I doubt there's the option to shift on the Housing Ombudsman Code element, and you don't want to end up falling foul of the Housing Ombudsman.
Okay, thanks, Anne-Marie. I'm going to, we have another question actually in the chat, which is a really good one. I'm going to put Kate on the spot, I think. And the question is about, where does the landlord function start and finish in a local authority, especially given that some activities, perhaps like antisocial behaviour, may be structured in a sort of way that they're not in the traditional landlord function teams. At least I think that's what the question is getting at.
Yeah, and I really recognise that for local authorities, it's not necessarily so neatly parcelled up as it is in the PRP sector on housing. However, I think right across the sector, there are issues such as antisocial behaviour, and that's a good example where this is a bit of a headache. And you might notice from our tenant satisfaction measures, what we've talked about is working particularly in partnership with others and with other agencies. So it leaves the door open that you might not be the only sort of force for having the sort of levers on some of these things. It's about working in partnership. So I think that would work. But I think for proactive consumer regulation, we are outcome focused. We want to see that the outcomes are right in terms of tenants living in quality, safe homes and accessing good landlord services. And I still think that is perfectly possible within the parameters of this. But it's a headache for housing associations as well, because some of this overlaps actually with local authorities.
Thank you very much. That actually is the, that is all the questions, and we're dead on 11:50, and all of our delegates and attendees, I think, do have busy schedules, so I think we will let them go there. Can I thank everyone, Kate especially, for coming today. Really appreciate your time and for your insights, and also our speakers from Altair, Anne-Marie and Kevin. Thank you very much for your contributions. And Jodie in the background, who kept the technology working perfectly. For anyone listening still there now, that was the first time we've used this system today. We've switched over to a new conferencing system, and I think it worked fine. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.